Welcome to Curious Minds. I know there's a lot of curious minds out there about what in the world is going on with society, with our world, with the coronavirus. But the thing is, nobody really knows. We're in a time of trial. This is not something that any nation has had to deal with to the extent and with the technology that we have right now. So there's a whole lot of questions about, are we doing the right thing? Are we going overboard? Are we not doing enough? And then theological, philosophical questions like, why does something like this happen? What is the exchange rate between human lives and human freedoms? And what is the level of God's sovereignty and human responsibility regarding everything that's going on? How are we supposed to think through this kind of thing? And how do we think through it as Christians? And how can we as Christians help non-Christians think through it? So some of this would relate back to a moral argument. If you think sparing lives is important, you're telling me that the human life is valuable, that there's dignity that's intrinsic to the human life, which harkens back to a value giver that is not a human himself, because this is the foundation of human value. This value giver is God. At the same time, this value giver has given value to humans in a way that's exhibited in human freedoms, economic freedoms, social freedoms, and things like that. So if our economy tanks, and if our relationships tank, is that worth the trade-off for some of the lives that are being lost? And part of the mystery here is we have no idea how many lives would be lost if we did not take careful preventative measures. And that's a very scary thought. There was something called the Spanish flu that killed 25 million, and that was a time when the population was a lot less. So these things have happened in the past. Plagues and diseases have wiped out people. We're aware of that, and the last thing we want to do is see that happen again. So there is something to be appreciated in the agony of restricting your freedoms, of restricting your social interaction, of businesses and economies tanking. There's something very noble about saying we value human life to the point that we can make sacrifices. There's something very Christian about that attitude. I want to cover more about what certain people and certain ministries have shared about this, just to kind of broaden the perspective about what is right and to what extent should we view God as being in control of this. First thing I saw was John MacArthur. He did not seem to be really emotionally involved in what's going on, but he said this is a reminder of the imminence of death. Human frailty is being exposed, and that's not completely a bad thing. It shows a lack of human control over the things that are going on in our world. And he also said that makes this an ample time to proclaim the gospel. Okay, I think MacArthur probably could have used a little more sympathy and compassion, but those things are to be taken into account. The reminder of death and the relevance of the gospel. Now, the 700 Club, a popular TV show on TBN, reminded us that this is a time to pray. It's also a time to learn new strategies for connecting with people. You've probably seen and been to an online church lately. Okay, online meetings, new strategies. Is this developing us? Is this making us better? Who knows? But this is what's necessary to do. It's a necessary time to pray. Life Church, the church planted by Craig Groeschel. Life Church had a pretty creative presentation on interviewing different people over the web, and they showed that churches are making a big difference. Churches are rising to the occasion. They're delivering items to the elderly. They're collecting items at the church that would be necessities, and to prevent the elderly from going out into the public and putting themselves at risk, they're delivering to the elderly. So they shared several stories of that going on. Okay, there's an opportunity to serve in that way. It's a good response. Ray Comfort, the evangelist from Southern California, he sees that this has created a new level of openness to the gospel, kind of like MacArthur said. But at the same time, they've also banned public access to these places, the universities and the beaches. So people are very open, but there's no one really physically present to hear it. So that's kind of interesting, to be determined what kind of effectiveness in gospel presentation will result from this. Comfort also was producing a couple 100,000 tracts. They look like a face mask. On one side has general health advice, 7 points, and on the other side, a presentation of the gospel. Creative, timely, relevant. Okay, T.D. Jakes, a popular pastor in Texas, not always in favor of what he does, but it was interesting to see him teach from home, I presume, and having no one present. Jakes shared that churches and pastors are really in a lose-lose situation. And this was probably shared a week or two ago when there was still the debate on whether to close churches or not. Government-church interaction becomes kind of awkward here. Should churches meet or should they not? There was a lot of uncertainty. Jakes also saw this parallel between the coronavirus pandemic and Jesus in the boat with his disciples during a storm. The disciples are in a panic. What do we do? What do we do? It's kind of like the mad shopping that we've been seeing. This panic, they believe that the storm is so strong that it's going to kill them. Jesus calmly gets up, says, "Peace, be still." So Jake says that there's a point at which God is going to extend his hand over the storm of this pandemic and say, "Peace, be still." And maybe there's something about human faith that is being triggered by the storm that we see around us. And Jakes doesn't get into this, although some others do, and I'm sure he would agree. As people pray, as people learn to trust God in this, when the shock value of it goes down, and we have the resolve to pray, maybe then God extends his hand over the storm as we ask him, as we say, "We are going to die unless you intervene," and he says, "Peace, be still." Could be an interesting parallel, certainly something worth considering. Now, something that impressed me when I was watching Jakes share this is he's a guy that often gets really caught up in the emotion of the audience. And this kind of drives him to be overly emotional and sometimes less rational. But here he was without that audience interaction, and it kind of drives this authenticity in a unique kind of way. So I think that's going to contribute in the long run to preaching, now that preachers that are used to talking to thousands are having to simply speak from the heart without getting any affirmation and feedback. I think it's going to contribute to their sincerity, their connection with God in some ways. And that reminds us, hey, when you preach, like when you worship, remember the audience of one. You first preach for the glory of God, not the affirmation of the people watching you. Okay, from one Texas preacher to another, controversial Texas preacher, Joel Osteen apparently kept his church open longer than most churches did, and this, of course, drew some criticism. T.D. Jakes pointed this out. Lakewood, Osteen's church, got a mandate from the city of Houston that they had to close, and only then did they fully close their doors. Osteen talks kind of two ways about God's level of control in this situation. He said, yeah, God is fully in control, and of course, in typical Osteen fashion, talks about being happy, cheerful, putting trust in God, not letting it get us down. Now, his wife said, yeah, but there are certain things that we can be doing. All right, God is in control, says Joel. And Victoria says, but we need to be taking some responsibility here. All right, Osteen also pointed out opportunities. Crisis is opportunity, he said. Now, that's very positive, but I don't have a problem with that. I think that's a good way to put it. There are opportunities to accomplish new things. A lot of people have pointed out the opportunities to connect more deeply with their families during this time. It's having to raise our creativity regarding how we communicate. So there could be some good contribution to that in the long run. Skip Heitzig, here in Albuquerque at the Calvary Chapel, he said now is the time to ramp up ministry, not let it diminish or not avoid it. So he's instituting the kindness campaign. They're helping to supply necessities to those in need, kind of like what Life Church was doing. Calvary is also involving all its staff and looking to involve a lot of support from the community to be able to get this done. And I agree with that too. It is a time to ramp up ministry. It's a time to re-examine where the ministry needs lie. So that's the way some of the pastors are responding. And you may say, well, with all the positives that they're identifying in this, is that maybe why God allows it? I'm not sure I would go to that extent, but I think it's interesting looking over maybe the spectrum of how people interpret why God allows something like this to take place. And it spans from the complete human responsibility side to God's total sovereignty side. And then branching off is kind of an open theism side and a Pentecostal side. So the question is the massive coronavirus pandemic due to God's power and his complete intention, or is it due to human behavior? Is it simply nature at work, or is God pinpointing specific people to strike with the virus? Well, Hugh Ross seems to land on the science side. No surprise if you're familiar with Reasons to Believe. He says that this is a natural occurrence of history. He saw the Spanish flu, which I mentioned earlier, as the last worldwide pandemic, killing 25 million, including 675,000 in the U.S. This was almost exactly 100 years ago, 1918. Now, Wuhan, China, Ross says that that's kind of an ideal location for such a virus to germinate. They're in highly dense areas, dense with people and dense with animals. We should expect viruses like this to happen. And by the way, this ministry, Reasons to Believe, has a pretty interesting teaching from Anjanette Roberts on why God created something like viruses. And she goes into the fact that most viruses are actually positive in nature. Now, Wuhan, China, an ideal location for this to happen, should not be a surprise if we just think of things in terms of science and nature working themselves out in our society. We kind of dictate how nature reacts to things because we're a great influence of nature. Is God responsible for it or humans responsible for it? We seem to be influencing the way nature operates. Now, Ross is actually surprised that a virus like this did not trigger earlier. He said the conditions have been there for it, and it's been delayed longer than he would expect. And he also really appreciates the scientific research, the medicine, the ingenuity of doctors and medical researchers in this, and believes that God's sovereignty has a way of working itself out through such people. So there you go. You have a great deal of human responsibility. You have nature at work. You have God creating a general good planet. And you have him creating people made in the image of God who can then be instruments of God as creating cures for this. So a large extent of human responsibility. Okay, John MacArthur, John Piper may come at this from a different angle. Piper is taught, and I'm sure MacArthur agrees, there's absolutely no stray molecule or atom in the universe. If there was one stray atom, that would radically change who we consider God to be and would be bordering on blasphemy. So complete control. Control to the extent God pinpointing certain people. I know it sounded extreme earlier. God has sovereignly chosen who's going to get it and who's not. Now, how do you couple that with what Victoria Osteen was saying? Yes, but we have some part in this too. Why are we taking such measures if God is in such specific control over who gets it? And that starts to border on what Ross was saying, that we're actually agents in dictating what nature does at certain times. Now, Greg Boyd would take an open theist approach here. He says that God works through present possibilities. The future is open to real possibilities. So the onset of the coronavirus may not be something that God determined and desired. He didn't cause it to happen. It's not his sovereign choice to wipe out X number of people in X number of places across the world. But in fact, this is something that he sees and experiences along with us, and he works through us in it. He's putting on the hearts of the people how to manage, how to take control. And he has power to do things through it as he sees fit as well. The big thing with open theism is releasing God from responsibility for the triggering of something like the coronavirus. Pentecostals would probably favor the view that this is a wake-up call, and it's a time to prove the power of God. Heard the 700 Club say, it's time to pray. Pentecostals would probably make that the central focus. It is time to pray. It is time to see the supernatural release of God's power over the situation. A lot of Pentecostals are also pretty against what Piper and MacArthur would stand for in that radical sovereignty view. Instead, they see what goes on in the world as happening as a response to human prayer, human responsibility. But they probably do favor what Osteen said, as this is also an opportunity. Anytime something drastic is happening on the earth, I think Pentecostals will see it as an opportunity for God to intervene in the most intense ways. Thus, something like this could potentially spark revival in the long run. They think that through invoking God's presence and power into the situation, the difficulty, whatever it is, physically, mentally, spiritually, that this difficulty is overcome. Invoking God's presence into the situation. Now, Greg Koukl, who I probably adhere most to out of the ones that I looked at, he says that there's an element that is God's will and an element that is not God's will. Now, like Koukl, I like to focus on the specific will of God and the permissive will of God. Specific will being, ideally, this is what I want to happen. But permissive will being, these are the boundaries within which you can operate. So if you're a parent and you want your kid to eat the pure whole grain cereal in the morning, but you're willing to offer them 3 choices, you have formed your ideal will within the options that are available to the child. Your specific will may or may not be done because you've given the child enough freedom to be able to pick the things within the permissive will. So things won't get so bad with a good parent, but things aren't always done within the specific parameters that the parent ideally desires. Now, I also believe that God has ideal plans beginning with the situation we find ourselves in presently. It may not be the situation that it was supposed to be at this moment, but God uses what happens in the moment to bring about things that work toward His good Kokel points to Joseph in Egypt in the book of Genesis. And the famous line there is, "What you guys meant for evil, God has used for good." Joseph feared God in the situation that he found himself in, and that caused something that should have been a bad situation, was done against God's will, to be turned into something that actually worked for God's greater good. And I think that pretty well describes the situation we're faced with. What is God's level of sovereignty over this? I don't target God with full responsibility of pinpointing each individual who dies from the coronavirus, because I think we can do something, as we are instruments of God in our world, to do the right things to make sure those numbers stay as low as they should. Now, I don't know how to evaluate the trade-off between sacrificing lives and keeping the economy going. I don't know how that's supposed to look, and I don't know how the elderly especially would expect that to look. I have heard a couple people lately say, if I'm elderly and I'm dying from the coronavirus, I don't want this world to tank on my behalf. On the other hand, you can't really put a price on a human life. And if there's something you can do to preserve that life, you should. And on the other hand, I've heard people say that there are certain freedoms that we always use that come at a risk. Driving was the example used. All the speed limits could be 30 miles an hour, but we found this harmony between safety and efficiency and freedom, and have cranked up the speed limits, sometimes to 80 miles an hour. More freedoms, more efficiency. Unfortunately, it costs more lives, as more fatal car accidents are likely to take place at faster speed limits. The number of fatalities from car accidents has exceeded 30,000 people per year in the United States for 73 straight years. Many freedoms lead to fatalities. As we examine God's relation to tragedies and pandemics, maybe the same thing needs to be considered. Freedom leads to fatalities. We have the leaders putting in place the guidelines that they believe we should be following. They're educating us on this. Now it's our duty to be the best citizens, leading the way, demonstrating hope to a world that's in a lot of confusion at this moment. But in an ultimate sense, there's so much hope there, even if somebody's on their deathbed. People were on their deathbed before the coronavirus. Life expectancies used to be a lot shorter. Death of newborns used to be much more frequent, but we've ramped up the expectations, and that's okay. But now that people are so earthly minded, the fears trigger. An earthly concern about curing a disease, a virus. Earthly concerns about maintaining the economy, maintaining freedoms, staying in social interaction. But the promises for us are never in regards to worldly things. Jesus said in John 16:33, "These things I have spoken to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you'll have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world." In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world. He was careful to not make a promise regarding worldly things. Whatever happens in this world, happens in this world. It may hurt, and that's okay. It may bring a lot of worry, confusion, and concern, and that's okay. You seek first God's kingdom, the one who clothes the lilies of the fields, the one who cares for each sparrow and has the hairs of your head numbered. He cares for you, but not in the way that you often care for yourself, with worldly well-being. He transcends that, so there's a comfort present that transcends worldly struggles. Jesus exhibited this on the cross, didn't he? The greatest earthly trouble was taking place, the greatest pain, and yet he knew that the greater good was taking place through it, because he knew that which overcomes the world, as did the disciples after him. Paul had to endure a lot of trials and tribulations and being beaten and all these things. Worldly struggles, worldly pain. In Romans 8, he goes into some detail about this, and I'll close with this. He said, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us." That's 8:18 in Romans. Whatever struggles take place now, there is an incomparable weight of glory that's awaiting us. He goes on, "For the anxious longing of the creation waits eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God." Right? This is how we're meant to be, he's saying. The making right of all things is forthcoming when God's beauty and glory are finally revealed. That weighs so much heavier than any earthly struggles. Verse 20, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God." So he's saying that creation undergoes corruption because of the sin that dwells on earth. This earth is not supposed to be the ideal dwelling place. That's forthcoming. Viruses are a reminder of that. Untimely deaths are a reminder of that. The day-to-day pains that we feel, usually regarding relationships, are a sign of that. This isn't supposed to be the perfect place. God never meant a sinful world to be that representative perfect place that completely identifies with his beauty and glory. Verse 28, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Don't miss the second half of that verse. This will not turn out good for those who have their eyes off of God. It will continue to be painful and hopeless. But to those who love God, they see a relationship that transcends anything that earth could leave them wanting. And those who are called according to his purpose. His purpose. We have our ideas of how this world should look and what should be going on, but God's purpose is often much different. And I don't know exactly how to describe his purpose in this. There were some different ideas presented by other preachers and apologists. This will turn out for the good if you pledge to love God through it and live according to his purpose. And then verse 35, who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Goes on and on. None of these things can separate you from the love of God. And I know that in the distraction of the coronavirus, it is very easy to take our eyes off of God, off of his will, off of who he is, off of the promises that he has for us, and to focus on the doom and gloom, to focus on the restriction of freedom and the anxiety that comes from stay-at-home orders. But we're good citizens when we follow the leaders and the experts in these regards. They're not doing anything to persecute or to tell us to not share our faith. We just have to be creative about it. But remember, the ultimate cure is not going to be found in some medical breakthrough. You'll just die from something different. The ultimate cure is the forgiveness of your sins, where the ultimate overcoming of death is found. And since Jesus rose from the dead, we have confidence that we also come to life in him. So any earthly hardships, like it says at the end of Romans, will not separate us from the love of God because he's overcome the last enemy, that's death. With that, let's continue working through this issue together. Let's come out the other side stronger than ever, and let's be thankful for the number of lives that we saved in making these personal sacrifices during this time, fighting the invisible enemy, one being the coronavirus, and one being the powers and principalities that seek to destroy us by hurling us into distraction and worry and whatever can lead us to trust in ourselves and in earthly things rather than trusting in God, our faithful maker. Well, next week, nothing planned. May need to continue on topics like this because it just seems to be on people's minds so much. And we may also have a look at biblical authenticity in the near future. So with that, have a very happy quarantine and a very happy social isolation. I'm isolating right there with you as we continue to grow in the grace and the love of God through whatever trial comes our way. May God bless and guide you.